Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 175. This week the questions are taken from Guide 227, that's the guide to the Duke of Edinburgh class armoured cruisers, and the Wednesday video on the Polish Navy from its founding to the fall of Poland in 1939. Today we kick off with a question from Never Go Full Pony, who asks, how was Klaus Störtebeker so effective? Piracy in the North Sea in the 14th century wasn't an easy task, so how did he manage to become such a scourge? Well, here's what he might have looked like if our modern reconstruction techniques are any good, and if indeed the skull it's based on is in fact his, as it's supposed to be. But, that aside, the main reason it appears that he managed to become so successful, successful to a certain degree, he was eventually caught and executed, which I don't think quite counts as the absolute pinnacle of success, but nevertheless, he did quite well for himself before that. But that seems to have come from a start which actually characterises a fair number of fairly successful pirates across the world, which is that he started off actually as what these days we might call a privateer or a mercenary. He was a hired gun, effectively. Well, hired multiple guns, given the size of his ship, in a war between Denmark and Sweden. And that obviously meant that he would have learned an awful lot about the North Sea, the passage between the North Sea and the Baltic itself, in an environment where he was officially supported and had ready access to supplies, and so he would be able to operate across the complete range whilst being able to, learn where the trade routes were, what times of year certain types of ships sailed, where the best places to hide out were, etc., and so on. And as I said, you see this quite a lot with a number of other pirates. They work either officially, potentially as naval officers, or semi-officially as privateers for larger navies, which gives them an opportunity to build up sea experience, knowledge of trade routes, knowledge of places to hide, and all these kinds of things. And then they go rogue. And this is what seems to have happened with him. After the war that he was paid to be involved with concluded, he decided he quite liked the idea of raiding and taking everybody's stuff. And he happened to be sitting right smack bang in the middle of the Hanseatic League's trade lanes. And at this point in time, when he was around, they were very wealthy. We're talking about basically the late 14th century. The Hanseatic League had almost a monopoly on trade in the area, and that trade was good. There was a lot of valuable materials being moved around with not an awful amount of security. And so you had a experienced mercenary who knew exactly where everything is and probably knew most of the people, at least in passing, who might be sent to try and stop him. And so with that, he had the intelligence both in his head and, in terms of combat intel, that meant he could run rings around pretty much anyone sent out to catch him and knew exactly where and when to hit the merchant lanes to take the richest prizes. Until, of course, eventually his luck runs out and he gets executed. But that's, in a lot of ways, as I said, basically the summary of the career of an awful lot of the more successful pirates. Frank Damaris asks, considering the pursuit of Goeben and Breslau, it occurs to me that regardless of the specific properties of the 9.2 and 7.5 inch guns in the British squadron, the use of central director firing on Goeben, if used, was likely to be extremely important to the outcome. Am I correct in thinking that Goeben had central director firing for its 11 inch guns, whilst all of Troubridge's cruisers had guns with local control only? And if so, do you think this difference in fire control compatibility, combined with Goeben's speed and ability to control the range, invalidates the comparison with Graf Spee and the River Plate? In and of itself, I don't think it's going to make a tremendous difference. You've got to remember that whilst central director firing was a thing that was invented for battleships, battlecruisers, etc., pre-World War I, simply inventing a thing does not guarantee its immediate deployment to the rest of the fleet. Unfortunately, life isn't like a computer game where you complete your upgrade and suddenly all units where that upgrade is applicable have it. Certain degrees of director firing were installed in at least the mid to late dreadnoughts and battle cruisers, but these were improved over time. Moltke, for example, had a fire control director top fitted to her foremast in 1914. Goeben had been out and about in the Mediterranean for a few years at that point, and of course would never get back to Germany, and so couldn't receive a similar upgrade, at least while she was charging around the Mediterranean trying to avoid things. She could have obviously been then, and was refitted several times, once in Ottoman and later Turkish service, but that was for the future at the point that we're talking about. So whilst it's true that a bunch of armoured cruisers are also not exactly going to have the world's latest and greatest direct-to-fire control equipment for the most part, I don't think Goeben's advantage in that particular department is massively greater than the fire control available to Troubridge's cruisers. I think the two wider impacts that you have to consider when it comes to Troubridge's squadron facing off against Goeben and Breslau is, one, whether or not they can force the engagement, and, well, secondarily, under what weather conditions, including light, they can force it, but whether or not they can even, force it at all. But if they can, and battle commences, then whilst Goeben does have superior speed, as you indicated, she is also, wanting to head east. So there is a certain amount of restriction in her ability to maneuver. If Troubridge can place himself in a place that Goeben wants to go, then she has to either close the range or go around, and that will take time. But I think the other major factor involved is the fact that Troubridge doesn't have to win. Troubridge only has to damage Goeben, which is pretty much a very similar situation to Graf Spee and River Plate. Exeter, Ajax, and Achilles didn't have to and didn't sink Graf Spee. They just had to bang her up hard enough that she was then, at least in the opinion of her captain, unable to continue with her mission. And given that you have 4 armoured cruisers, and Goeben can only shoot at one at any given time, with any degree of accuracy, if they can get an engagement, and even assuming we detach one of them to deal with Breslau, that still means that at any given point in the opening stage of the battle, you have 2 armoured cruisers who have got basically free-for-all firing conditions to engage Goeben. Whilst 9.2 and 7.5 inch shells, as you say, they may, probably not going to get through the 11-inch armour unless the Goeben does something truly stupid, like close to point blank. It doesn't really matter as much, because if they can just smash things up, possibly maybe damage the steering, in some way slow it down, or just generally make a bit of a mess of Goeben, then at that point it's kind of mission accomplished. They can, if necessary, pull back at that point, because it's going to make Goeben a lot easier to catch for anybody else who is chasing, like actual battle cruisers. And to be perfectly honest, when you look at the various things that Goeben shot at during the First World War, whilst she did hit and sink a few things, her overall gunnery performance is not that spectacular. So, yeah, of course, the armoured cruisers are not exactly going to be tanking 11-inch gunfire anytime soon, but I'm pretty sure you could have done a relatively even trade in terms of, getting Goeben crippled enough for her to be then able to be finished off by other means, or, as I say, if something dramatic happens, possibly even by the rest of the squadron, because they do have torpedo launchers, and the 9.2-inch guns, if Goeben is somehow slowed down or boxed in, can actually do a fair bit of damage if they get close enough. Kurumi asks, why did the Littorio class have raised aft turrets? I would assume lowering the turrets, if at all possible, would cut down on the barbette weight and lower the centre of gravity, so what spurred this design choice? You're absolutely right. In the vast majority of cases where you have a single aft turret, that turret is usually flush with the deck that it's mounted on. But as you can see in this picture, Littorio's aft turret is in fact raised on a barbette, almost as if there's another turret there to superfire over. I mean, you can imagine kind of if you had a 4th turret there and it was down on the quarterdeck, well then now the what's the actual aft turret is in a perfect position to superfire over it. But of course, that turret doesn't exist. There are two main reasons that the Italians went for this layout, one of which is actually quite a bit more important than the other. The less important reason is you can see at the back there they have aircraft handling facilities. By having the turret a bit higher up in its normal rest position, there's actually a fair bit of the quarterdeck, in fact pretty much the entire quarterdeck, that can be used for whatever it is you happen to be doing. Whereas if that turret was lower down, you lose a significant amount of space. Also, if you happen to be firing, then the blast effects on that equipment will be slightly less if the turret is higher up. But I say that's the much lesser concern reason. The main reason is that, as you can probably see just to the right of the aft turret there, is one of the secondary battery turrets. Now, if the gun is, or the main gun turret is at deck level, then it's actually going to have a rather limited arc past the 90-degree broadside. It can maybe get 20-25 degrees, if that, forward, possibly less. And there's going to be some quite interesting blast effects on, well, that 6-inch turret and the 90mm secondaries. Whereas, if you elevate the gun turret, which is what they have done, then this aft gun turret can actually swing round over the 6-inch secondary turret and can then fire much, much closer to the ship going forward. So it gives the aft turret a much better arc of fire, which in turn improves the tactical flexibility of the ship, because it means that it can approach a target, not obviously head-on, but a lot closer to head-on and maintain a full broadside of 9 guns than it would do if the turret was one deck level further down. So that is the single largest reason why the Italians went for this, is basically to increase the tactical capabilities of the ship. Sean Killian asks, did contact detonated torpedoes have any provisions to go off if their target had managed to almost evade, resulting in the torpedo grazing the hull? Yes and no. So you've got to remember that when it comes to a torpedo, at least, you know, a large torpedo as might be fired from a destroyer or cruiser or a submarine, as opposed to the somewhat lighter weight aerial torpedoes, you're talking about a weapon that weighs about as much as a small family saloon car, which, depending on the speed setting, is going to be hitting something at between 35 and up to 50 miles an hour for most of them, and a few maybe going even quicker than that. So hopefully none of you have been in this situation, but I'm probably fairly sure that some of you have been in car accidents of some description. If you can imagine being in a, you know, say roughly a small to mid-sized family saloon, and you pile into something at, let's say, 40 miles an hour, if you hit that thing at, let's say it's a fairly solid object like a crash barrier or a wall, if you hit that going at 45 degrees, you're still going to feel an awful lot of deceleration going forward, even though you might feel a little bit more if you went head-on into it. And it's going to take a fairly shallow angle before you don't feel a significant jolt. And most contact fuses relied on that significant forward jolt in order to set them off. So striking a target at an angle, not really a problem for most torpedoes in World War II. If you got to a angle that was very shallow, then yes, you might get something of a deflection, if you like, but it would be very rare. Because the other thing you've got to remember is that, well, I said in that case you're talking about a solid wall. A ship's hull is solid to you, solid to me. It's not so solid to a 1.5 ton projectile coming in at 40 plus miles an hour. Even an angled glancing hit is going to dish in that plate, which is then going to cause that, assuming the torpedo doesn't just punch through, at the very minimum, that dished in plate is going to cause, you know, it's going to catch the torpedo, which is then going to obviously slow it down a lot more, and therefore cause the weapon to detonate. So in terms of sort of, I guess, a horizontal impact fuse or detonator, not really a thing in like most World War One and World War Two torpedoes. So if you were absolutely lucky and you got maybe a 15-degree or less angle, let's say, then yes, you might be able to glance a torpedo off of your hull, and it did happen on occasion. But to be honest, at that point, the chances of that happening are so remote, it's not worth putting entire extra backup systems in to account for a 1 in a million chance. And the reason I say it's also a 1 in a million chance is that, to be completely honest with you, if you're coming in at that shallow an angle, whilst your torpedo does weigh, as we said, a fair bit and is going at a fair old speed, the ship itself weighs a lot more and is also probably moving at a fair old clip itself, if we're talking about a warship, at which point the flow of water around a ship, if the torpedo is coming in at such a shallow angle, is probably going to be enough to shunt the torpedo away, or at least hold it away from the hull just enough for it to not make much, if any, contact anyway. So it's kind of one of these things when it comes to military weapons of there is a marginal chance of this occurring, given if you assume that your contact detonator otherwise works pretty well, but it's such a low chance of occurring that it's not worth the extra expense, generally speaking, to try and compensate for it. It's better to just have cheaper, more plentiful torpedoes and take another shot. General Chase asks, if World War II hadn't happened, do you think the battleship age would have lasted longer? Certainly, I think battleships were still seen as the primary capital unit at the start of World War II. Carriers did have their place, and their place was getting larger and larger. But even the Japanese, who, to be fair, in terms of absolute mass strike doctrine, were probably by far and away ahead of everyone else in 1939, even they still looked at the carriers as an ancillary support element that would enable them to have a decisive line battle. And the US Navy and Royal Navy, again, were using carriers as support elements to their fleet, not the decisive element of the fleet. It took a little while in World War II for that to change. Without World War II, then yes, the battleship age is almost certainly going to continue. You've got a lot of battleships under construction at that point. Obviously, without World War II, the Japanese are going to complete more Yamatos. The Germans will complete the H-39s. The Italians will complete all 4 Littorios and probably move on to a successor. The French, as usual, will end up with a technical class of 4 Richelieus, where no two are actually alike. The Americans are going to get the Iowas, and, well, the thing is, whether or not the last 2 Iowas that were never actually finished would be Montanas in this case is obviously open to question. But the Montanas certainly are going to be built, how in whatever numbers, whether that includes what should have been Iowas 5 and 6 or whether those become Montanas 1 and 2, who knows. The British are obviously going to finish the Lions. Everyone at this point is going to be in something of a naval arms race. Who knows, those Russians might even complete a Sovietsky Soyuz that can stay afloat for more than 5 minutes. And there's a lot of older ships that need replacement or modernization or both. So probably through the mid-1940s, maybe into the late 1940s, they're still going to be using battleships, especially all the new modern battleships, as the benchmark. The other thing to consider is that as and when news of Yamato and possibly the Super Yamatos comes out, and something like the Montana will now be seen as your entry-level battleship for the new age, once everybody else, in theory, starts going after similar-sized vessels, those ships are going to be massively more difficult to sink. And obviously aircraft technology, whilst it will still be advancing, it's not going to have quite the same crucible of fire that existed in World War II. Tactics also not going to develop quite as quickly in World War II. And you're going to end up, I think, in a situation where if some kind of war breaks out in the late 1940s, maybe even the early 50s, there's going to be a lot of carriers around, because they're going to be building those as well. There's going to be a lot of aircraft, and they're going to be facing against probably the hardest nuts to crack in terms of these super battleships. So the, I feel like, second generation fast battleships, or the post-treaty battleships, so Iowas, Lions, etc., plus the, I guess, the super post-treaty battleships, Montanas and other equivalents. And at that point, because you won't have had 3-4 years of grinding war, they're going to also be sailing with a bunch of escorts, rather than, Yamato going out with a partial flotilla of destroyers as its only escort. There's going to be cruisers, there's going to be other aircraft carriers, there's going to be other battleships and plenty of destroyers. Probably most people will be using dual-purpose batteries at this point. Radar will definitely be a thing. So getting after these massive battleships and then putting enough damage into them to actually make them go under is going to be a much more difficult, much more complex task than it was in World War II. Obviously, I think there's a fairly good likelihood that the aircraft carrier will still come to the fore in any kind of major conflict that breaks out in that time period eventually, but it's going to be a much longer, much harder slog, and there's going to be a lot more in the balance, especially if maybe the first 2-3 attempted mass carrier strikes on a mass fleet formation get shot to pieces or badly broken up. Declan McCaffrey asks, "Hi, I was just reading about CVEs and how poorly their crews regarded them in the Second World War. Could you explain why this was? Was there an engineering flaw, or did they just have rotten luck?" Obviously, experience is going to vary escort carrier to escort carrier, but there are a few reasons why crews would view escort carrier assignment as not particularly brilliant. Firstly, believe it or not, boredom. The vast majority of escort carrier missions, outside of when they were being dragged in as emergency carrier support in, say, Guadalcanal, or much later on when there wasn't much else of anything for them to do, so they might as well support invasions and landings, but the bulk of their work was convoy escort. And convoy escort, when you're an escort carrier, is not exactly the world's most exciting duty. At least if you're in a frigate or a sloop or a corvette or a destroyer, you get the occasional chance to go chasing off after an enemy submarine. With an escort carrier, your job is basically to sit in the middle of the convoy and do nothing and let the pilots have all the fun. And boredom is a massive problem when it comes to navies. In fact, the vast majority of large and wide-scale mutinies in navies have resulted not because the ships have been overworked, not because the ships have been under massively harsh discipline, but mostly because the crews have just been bored out of their skulls sitting around doing nothing for ages. And eventually they get so fed up they sometimes decide, you know what, we're going to start complaining about the little things. Obviously, other mutinies, they do actually have a legitimate point, like the mutiny of the Lash in Brazil, but you'd be surprised just how many mutinies can be traced back to the fleet basically has done nothing for 2 or 3 years. The sailors are so bored. Armed insurrection seems like a viable alternative. Anyway, so there's that. Coupled with the fact that, as you can see here with HMS Biter, escort carriers are not exactly the world's most stable of platforms. They're small, very high, and very wide up top, which means that in the slightest seas, I mean, okay, the sea here is a little bit steeper than perhaps you'd like on a good day, but this isn't exactly the world's worst sea. You can still see the horizon and it's relatively even. And yeah, that doesn't look like a fun thing to be on, does it? Unless I suppose you really like permanent roller coasters. So you're going to be bounced and tossed around the ocean. The Atlantic and the Arctic are fairly good at doing that quite often. And other than experiencing this bouncing, rolling, swaying motion, you don't have a tremendous amount to do unless you are a pilot or potentially supporting a few of the aircraft. And then finally, you have the fact that if something exciting actually does happen to you, it's probably going to be very exciting and very short, because To fit all the necessary aviation facilities into a hull the size of an escort carrier, I'm afraid passive protection took something of a back seat. Yeah, you might have some anti-aircraft guns, and maybe you can turn a few of those heavier anti-aircraft guns into an anti-surface role, but if you actually get hit by something, your armour protection is, well, I hope one of your crewmates likes putting posters up on the outer bulkhead, because that's probably significantly improved the overall percentage of protection that is being granted to you. Yeah, there's effectively no armour, effectively no anti-torpedo defence, and the thing's chock full of aviation fuel and munitions. For context, one of the newer US aircraft carriers, the one that's being named USS Doris Miller, well, obviously, the gentleman in question got fairly highly awarded for his actions, but the way he ended up leaving this world was aboard an escort carrier that got hit. And it turns out that when you're in what's effectively a converted merchant hull packed full of explosives with very little in the terms of, passive armor protection or torpedo defense, and you get hit by a large incoming explosive projectile, the whole thing tends to try and reenact the Battle of Jutland and go pop. At least it was quick. So, yeah, if you're on an escort carrier, you've basically got the trifecta of your job's probably going to be incredibly boring, your job's probably going to give you a fairly good experience of what it feels like to be in a tumble dryer, and should anything exciting happen to you, there's a very high chance you're going to explode. So, in light of that, you can probably understand why in most circumstances escort carrier crews just kind of went, yeah, but I could have been on a better carrier, a bigger carrier. Please transfer me as soon as possible. Josh Thomas Moore asks, if the British had used Highball on Tirpitz when they hoped to use it in 1943, what do you think the result could have been? Well, assuming that they solved the problems with the actual launching apparatus, etc., so it was at that point an operational weapon the way it would be later on in the war, I actually think Highball could have been fairly successful. So for those of you who don't know, Highball is this little thing here, aka the half-ton golf ball of death. It's a development on the bouncing bomb that was used against the Myrna, Sorp and Ida dams. I believe that's how they're pronounced. Possibly Ida, I don't know. And the idea was effectively the same as those bouncing bombs. So you fly in low and fast, drop the bomb with a backspin, it goes skipping across the water, except that unlike the ones used against the dams, which would then hit the dam wall and sink down and then explode, these things were just supposed to punch straight into the side of a ship and then explode with, about the same amount of explosive as being hit by several high explosive battleship shells if they had armor penetrating caps as well, which is a bit of a juxtaposition, but gives you some idea of the destructive power involved. Now, if they'd used them against Tirpitz, I mean, given the test against Corbeil and Malaya, they would have quite happily punched straight into the side of the ship and then gone off inside and either wrecked it or sunk it quite easily. The reason I think it might well have been quite fairly successful is that unlike the tall boys that were eventually used to finish off Tirpitz, or the dive bombing barracudas that tried to use semi-armor piercing bombs, etc., the Highball had to be deployed from very low altitude and was supposed to be carried by mosquitoes, which in turn means that unlike the barracudas and the Lancasters, which had to come in high and therefore could be quite easily seen on German radar and have fighters scramble to protect them, and still relied on, getting the bomb to actually drop on the target, which was still something of an art at that point. With Highball carried by mosquitoes, you could run the mosquitoes in at very, very low altitude, possibly below the radar. Let's not get into whether or not the Mosquito was a stealth aircraft. There's a very good military aviation history video on why that's not really the case. But they could fly very low and just fly below the radar, or get lost in the clutter long enough that even if radar did pick them up, it would probably be far too late to scramble any defensive measures. They could then either fly over the mountains and down into the fjord, or possibly just fly down the fjord itself. All in all, not giving the Germans an awful lot of time to respond, at which point you can start popping these things off at Tirpitz and, well, skip bombing into a stationary target the size of a battleship is considerably easier than, dive bombing into the teeth of alerted anti-aircraft gunfire. So I think the chances of scoring one or more hits are fairly high, and, well, 300 kilos of explosive going off inside you is never going to be a particularly good thing. Thus, I think it probably would have knocked out Tirpitz before the end of 1943, which would have made an interesting set of circumstances, because with Scharnhorst going down at the end of the year, assuming they don't then take Highball to Scharnhorst, then there's an awful lot of ships that were being used to guard the Arctic convoy routes against those two ship sorting that are no longer needed and can head over to the Pacific in much earlier in 1944 than historical. Ethan Hatcher asks, how much did the US Navy contribute to the Great War? Obviously, arriving somewhat late in World War I, the US Navy was not in a position to do quite as much as the Marine Nationale or the Royal Navy had done for the majority of World War I, but the US Navy did make a fairly crucial and fairly welcome contribution. And no, it wasn't 6th Battle Squadron. Much as 6th Battle Squadron was, of course, welcome in the Grand Fleet, the Royal Navy was not exactly short of capital warships in 1917 and 1918. So 6th Battle Squadron, whilst it enhanced the killing power of the Grand Fleet, I think the best way to describe their addition, at least once their gunnery had been brought up to standard, would be like, saying, well, here's the Grand Fleet. This is a sledgehammer. This is a sledgehammer I'm going to apply to anyone who gets in range. Now the US fleet, well, the 6th Battle Squadron, the US fleet squadron that's sent over to help arrives. Well, now this is a sledgehammer that I've welded rusty nails to. Yes, it's going to hurt more. No, you probably weren't going to survive in the first place. Conversely, speaking of survival, in 1917, the Royal Navy was very, very concerned about U-boats. To an extent, in fact, that they never actually were in the Second World War. There were points where, with the U-boat campaign in 1917, there were notes and meetings being passed around and discussed in the British Admiralty where they were thinking, look, if this goes on for 6-8 weeks more, we are probably going to lose the war, because they were just losing ships and supplies at a rate that was not sustainable. What they needed were destroyers, lots of destroyers, for escort purposes, and they didn't have them, because whilst the German fleet was still around and was still a threat, the majority of Royal Navy destroyers were either with the Grand Fleet or with the Harwich Force or with the Channel Fleet, basically bottling up the Germans, and there was a gradual attrition of destroyers all through the war. They had a fairly active career. Replacements were being built, of course, but most of those were going into replacing ships that had been lost and just building up the size of the fleet generally. So the first thing that the US Navy was asked for once it joined the war was, please send destroyers. We need a lot of them to help with the convoy escorts. And so Admiral Sims dutifully showed up in mostly what's now Queenstown, what was Queenstown in Ireland. I can't remember exactly what it's called these days. Not that, I can guarantee you. But, yeah, so US destroyer flotillas showed up in Ireland to help with the convoy escort work. And that was their single biggest contribution, because it helped push the number of oceanic escorts for the convoys up over a point where, one, you could run more convoys, and two, those convoys were much, much better protected, which combined meant that losses to U-boats went down dramatically and losses of U-boats went up dramatically. And so they could start to relax a little bit about, not actually losing the war at sea. So those are the two major US Navy contributions to the Great War. But of the two, in terms of impact, Admiral Sims and his destroyers had by far the greatest impact, and it was, in a lot of ways, pretty much a war-turning event. Arctic Temper asks, why was the Royal Navy relieved by the scuttling of the High Seas Fleet? What problems would they have faced had its scuttling not taken place? Essentially, it relieved the Royal Navy of a rather thorny problem. Because of the way the war had worked out, the Royal Navy had the largest fleet by a long way, and it had a fairly considerable number of modern, or modernish, capital ships. Sure, they kind of realised by the end of the war the 12-inch ships were probably on their way out, but they had a lot of 13.5-inch ships, and they had a lot of 15-inch ships. So they were in a pretty good place. The US Navy, once the German Navy was out of the picture, was their next nearest competitor. And whilst the US Navy had a lot of ships on with 14-inch guns, there still weren't that many of them compared to the total 13.5 and 15-inch ships in the Royal Navy. The Japanese, similarly, had some 14-inch ships, but again, nowhere near as many. The French had basically given up with the Britannias. They were trying to build the Normandies, but it was fairly clear that wasn't really going to get them anywhere fast. The Italians, all of their ships were still 12-inch. They had the Caracciolo's theoretically on order, but again, not really going anywhere fast. And the Russians had caught communism, so they weren't going to be doing anything anytime soon. So all things looked pretty good for the Royal Navy. But the Kriegsmarine, well, the Kaiserliche Marine at this point, which would then become the Reichsmarine, which would then become the Kriegsmarine, was the elephant in the room. Because whilst there was their fair share of obsolete vessels, such as the Nassau's, which nobody really wanted except as scrap metal, there were also Baden, Bayern, Hindenburg, Der Flinger, maybe one or two of the other battle cruisers, certainly the Königs and Kaisers. Whilst the Königs, Kaisers and some of the older battle cruisers weren't necessarily fully up to spec with the latest and greatest in terms of firepower, they were still fairly well protected, still fairly modern, had a lot of fairly nice technology on them, and the Badens and Der Flingers especially were, and a bunch of the more modern cruisers were certainly up there, comparable in performance to most other ships of their time. And the Royal Navy's concern was that if the High Seas Fleet stays around, then it's going to have to be, via the terms of Versailles Treaty, which doesn't allow really Germany to have much of a navy, to be broken up and distributed. And given that the UK already has a big navy, everyone else is going to be agitating to get a hold of some of this navy, which means that a whole bunch of other navies that the Royal Navy would really rather not get access to German technology and, supplement or replace their older ships with German ships, would be able to do so. So when the Germans quite helpfully went and sunk their own fleet, whilst it was a bit of a kick in the face to the British because it happened on their watch in their harbour, it also meant that no one else could get their hands on all those lovely German ships and their technology, which suited the British just fine. In terms of problems they would have faced if the scuttling hadn't taken place, well, those sort of numbers and technology problems can be split into kind of two areas. They'd be worried about someone like, say, the US Navy or the Japanese Navy making off with something like the Hindenburg and ripping it apart to discover all its juicy technical secrets. And they'd also be worried, despite the fact, yes, technically they've been allied, but, the Royal Navy doesn't really have any permanent allies. They were worried about, nations like France, which had everything stall out, now having a relatively small fleet and potentially being able to turn around and go, actually, you know what? We're going to get rid of the Dantons, we're going to get rid of the Corbeils, maybe we'll keep the Britannias, but instead of those, we'd like the Kaisers or the Königs, and maybe we want Baden or Bayern as a flagship, and a bunch of their small cruisers to replace all our hopelessly obsolete ones. And now all of a sudden France's navy is actually relatively powerful for its size compared to what it was before, which is never a good thing in the Royal Navy's experience. So that would have been the other concern, and other navies could have tried to pull off a similar issue. And to a certain extent, if you look at the interwar French navy with the ships that survived, cruisers and such, that's pretty much what they did. The French adopted a fair number of ex-Kaiserliche Marine vessels into their inventory, but thanks to the scuttling, not in any great number and not of any massively great modernity. Whiskey Delta Golf asks, I asked a question earlier this year about early turret designs, and in your answer you briefly mentioned that there was a third type of turret besides the Coles and Ericsson designs. Please could you talk a bit more about this? Well, there were a bunch of small rival ideas going around that were variations on a theme of how to do a rotating turret. And perhaps at some point when I talk about the development of the turret specifically, I'll go into more fine detail about them. But the other major competing turret idea, which, to be fair, didn't get a tremendous amount of grip outside of a few ships in the 1860s, was one that was actually talked about earlier this week in the second Ironclad development video, which is the literal turret, as in turret in the sense of the turret you might find in a castle, as some people have helpfully pointed out in the comments over time. So in this particular setup, the turret does not rotate the way the Ericsson and Coles turrets do. Instead, the gun rotates within the turret. The turret is just a fixed mass of iron, and you rotate the gun within the turret to different firing ports. Now, this has the advantage of weighing less, because you don't have, the turning mechanisms, etc. You can't jam something that doesn't move, and so you either save weight, or in theory you can possibly make this kind of turret actually considerably thicker for the same weight. The disadvantage, of course, is that you have fixed arcs of fire from each gun port, and generally speaking you can only get a single gun in this kind of turret. So it has some fairly significant limitations, which is why most of the time, apart from a few experimental installations, it was not an especially favoured type of gun mounting. Ort Kaiser asks, how is it possible that two ships built in, let's say, 1890 or later, to ostensibly the same design, result in two different ships with different properties? Does the design not include a detailed plan for every part of the ship and its material properties, excluding instances where the differences are intentional? A lot of it comes down to the fact that even post-1890s, an awful lot of building warships, certainly in the early part of the 20th century, was still effectively a handcrafted artisan process. So, whilst broadly measurements were a lot more precise than they were perhaps in the 18th century, or even the 17th, or even parts of the early 19th, there's still a degree of variation going on. And it couldn't even be in terms of things like, when you're measuring something, are you measuring it using a fixed measuring stick or ruler? Are you measuring it using a tape measure? And if you're measuring something long using a tape measure, are you making sure it's tensioned? If you are making sure it's tensioned, how much tension are you putting on it? Or is there a bit of a dip? If you're using a fixed measuring stick, has that worn away a little bit at the end? Is it exactly right to, the nth degree? And even when the manufacturing process is being done, in theory, each of these beams or frames or plates, etc., should be exactly the same dimensions, but if you're told, right, we need let's say a hull plate that is, using random numbers, 20 feet by 12. Okay, so you make a hull plate that is 20 foot by 12, but do you try and shape it and craft it to be precisely 20 feet by 12? Do you perhaps leave just a fraction over, like maybe even an eighth of an inch or something like that, just on the basis that, well, if it's very fractionally oversized, I'm sure someone can just grind it down a little bit, but that's better than being undersized, in which case it's going to fail. And, when that plate is then in the shipyard and they're putting it onto the frames, it can even be a case of exactly where are the rivets going within that plate. and relative to that, where are they going into the frames? All of these things, because they're being done by hand, can introduce little errors, and those errors can add up by a fair bit. And that's assuming that, things like the frames are being made to exactly the same size and spec, which, again, if you think about how many frames go into a warship, if every one of them has a quarter inch, eighth of an inch error in them, individually, not too much of a problem. Once you've added all that up and combined it with all the other errors, you can end up with, 2 different ships where one is several feet longer than the other, or one is slightly narrower than the other, and so on and so forth. And that's assuming that someone in a shipyard doesn't have a bright idea about making a slight improvement to things. And, even today, that is, to a certain extent, still the case. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that the current HMS Prince of Wales, the Queen Elizabeth class carrier, is actually just a fraction longer than HMS Queen Elizabeth. So, yeah, things can be broadly standard, but still not actually carbon copies of each other. And that's before we get into the fact that ships built in different shipyards might be told, the design calls for X thousand horsepower delivered to the propeller shafts, but they might have 2 very different suppliers of boilers and machinery, which might have very different performance characteristics, even if in theory they should develop the same amount of shaft horsepower, at least, coming down the line. Chain Gun 1701 asks, in Star Trek Deep Space Nine, the USS Defiant is described as overpowered and overgunned for a ship her size, with her engines nearly tearing her apart in trials, and her space frame needing to be reinforced to withstand firing her own weapons. Have there ever been any real-life equivalents of this? And obviously, although Defiant works because the writers say so, if ship design issues were applied more realistically, do you think the Defiant would have been possible? I don't necessarily know if you could describe them as overpowered, but the Flatiron gunboats, an example of which can be seen here, come on, look at it, it's so absurd. Can definitely be described as overgunned for their size. This is basically a gun that happens to float and possibly has an engine attached to it. And look, they even stuck a dinky little one on top. Oh, it's so cute. Anyway, yeah, so there's those. But in terms of, if you like, Defiant type vessels in the early 20th century, I think the closest you get would be something like the Mogador, the French super destroyer class. Because when you compare the Mogador to, well, let's say a bunch of light cruisers, so you've got a ship that is just under 3,000 tons displacement standard. It's capable of almost 40 knots, so there's the fast part covered. And it has a main battery of 8 5.46-inch guns, because of course the French can never do anything in whole numbers, but still, they're within shouting distance of being 6-inch guns. So you then compare that to, say, an Arethusa class cruiser, and that's a proper light cruiser. Now that's just over 5,000 tons, so that is not quite, but almost double the displacement. And it's got 6 6-inch guns. So the Mogador actually has 2 more guns. They're fractionally smaller, but probably not tremendously makes much difference. And the Mogador has a lot more torpedoes, albeit, okay, fair enough, slightly less anti-aircraft armament. But then you've also got the Leander class, which, are just over 7,000 tons standard. So they are between 2 and 2.5 times the displacement of the Mogador. And they've got the same number of guns in the main battery. Again, the 6-inch, granted, is slightly a heavier gun, but not tremendously. And again, there is a slight increase in anti-aircraft armament on the Leander. But for the sheer size of the Leander compared to the Mogador, having a bit more AA is not exactly a massive outstanding achievement. And the Mogador is still obviously faster and carries more torpedoes. So, yeah, the Mogador and similar super destroyers that were either designed by the French as its predecessors or by people like the Germans to compete with it are probably the closest you get to the Defiant. They're massively overpowered, especially the French ones, and massively overgunned. Now, in terms of applying that more realistically to the Defiant, if you wanted to do so, well, actually taking a leaf out of the book of issues with some of the French super destroyers, one of their main issues was, yes, they could go very fast, but they were effectively useless at using their main guns when they were going that fast. So if they did want to use those main guns, they had to slow down, and other competitors like the German destroyers had stability issues when they tried to put even larger guns on their ships. So, I mean, with a spacecraft, you don't necessarily have to worry about quote-unquote stability issues, but one of the things, if I recall my Deep Space Nine lore correctly, was that the Defiant was not as fast as some other starships, even though it had a massively amped up power core, which is, I guess, in some ways a kind of a reflection of the issues with the French destroyers, i.e. Defiant is not as fast in flat-out sprint as other ships, and it's obviously then using its weapons at a lower speed than you might otherwise have been able to get out of it. But I think one of the other things that you could bring up when it comes to something like the Defiant would be kind of touched on when I was talking about the differences between a Mogador and a Leander or an Arethusa, which would be not anti-aircraft armament, but the idea of not being able to fend off certain kinds of attackers. So the Defiant perhaps would be very, very good at taking out things like birds of prey and Jem'Hadar attack ships, and if it can get a good strafing run in on a big ship, then sure, but it's going to be almost entirely weighted forward in terms of firepower. So if a big ship with all-round firepower, or a swarm of small ships that are even more agile than it and can therefore stay on its tail and out of its arc of main fire, those should be big problems for the Defiant. So it's good at taking on small to mid-sized starships, but small attack craft and big ships should be a fairly major problem for it. Yo Beef Jerky asks, ships later on near the 50s began to employ massive radars right astern and above the funnels. Why this specific location? Wouldn't that be inside the funnel smoke? And if that isn't a concern, what changed between previous ships and these ships to allow for useful stuff to be placed in the funnel smoke? Well, part of the reason for not having stuff aft in the potential area of effect of funnel smoke before was, well, people tend to react rather badly to being immersed for large amounts of time in a lot of smoke and hot exhaust gases, whereas machinery can be hardened against that. Not easily, but with a relative degree of ease. And, radar dishes don't require people to be there, so there's that. Obviously, you don't necessarily want them being superheated or covered in soot all the time, but that's part of the other factor, which is sheer necessity. Because by the late 40s, early 50s, it was becoming very, very clear that you did, in fact, need complete radar coverage. Except that, as you can see here with Galveston, they were rather running out of space, because radar at the time was not small, it was not compact, it was fairly big, it was fairly chunky, it was fairly heavy, and that limited how many radars you could fit on any individual mast, and it turned out you actually needed a lot of radars. These days, you can have multi-mode radars that can all do all sorts of fancy things, and even then, modern warships quite often have more than one type of radar aboard. But especially back then, you might need to have a long-distance, high-altitude air search radar. You might need a slightly different air search radar to look at lower altitudes. You'd then maybe need a surface search radar. You might then need a separate radar that does your gunnery fire control, a separate radar that does your anti-aircraft gunnery fire control as opposed to your surface gunnery control. And then you've also got long-distance radio communications, the fact that you want probably to have at least 2 sets of most radars, and multiple in the case of your anti-aircraft gun control radars, or later missile radars, because obviously if one breaks, you don't want that entire aspect of your sensor suite to go down, and all of a sudden you're looking at aerials and antennas and dishes and everything all over the place. And so you end up, especially in the early era of sort of gun missile tech, when radar's just about coming into its own, with ships like this where you've got masts and built up superstructures all over the place and radars going all over the place, and because you then get interference with what's now the main mast, the big black one on Galveston, that also kind of further necessitates having radar further aft, because there are going to be blind spots where the radar mounted forward can't see, so you need sensors mounted in the back anyway. It's not ideal, but it can be done, and it's better than not having the coverage. Shazak asks, What if the Błyskawica and Grom were both built as tribal class destroyers? How would that affect their service in World War II? Now, Dr. Clark may hunt me down in my sleep for saying this, but I don't actually think that building the Groms as tribal class would have been to their overall benefit. Now, the reason I say that is because when you consider their two careers, if you think of them as, okay, they're now tribals instead of Groms, what benefit do they get? Grom herself was sunk during the the Norwegian campaign. And yes, she did shore bombardment, and sure, at that point, having an extra gun probably would have been fairly useful to a degree. But, 7 4.7-inch guns or 8 4.7-inch guns, that's only slightly more explosive downrange, and wouldn't have helped her much at all in her actual, final battle where she was sunk by air attack. So, marginal benefit to having Grom as a tribal, but not a tremendously great one. Then you look at Błyskawica, and, well, she was equipped originally with Bofors 120mm guns, and that was partially why she was refitted with dual 4-inch instead. I have a feeling that if she was just a flat-out tribal buy, she may well have not been upgraded like that. If anything, she might have gotten the standard tribal type upgrade where she replaced X-turret with some anti-aircraft firepower, but otherwise would have probably stayed the same. Now, whether it was a tribal or as her actual layout, didn't make a tremendous amount of difference for the convoy escort work that she mostly did, but when she defended the Isle of Wight, having those dual-purpose 4-inch twin mounts instead of the 4.7s was a huge benefit. So at that point, being a tribal and maybe having one or two heavy AA guns, or possibly just having 4.7 with limited AA potential compared to the twin 4s, that would have actually been a significant downgrade for her in that particular circumstance. Everywhere else, as the few surface actions she took part in relative to her anti-submarine operations, having 7 Swedish 120 mils or 8 British 4.7s isn't really going to make all that much difference. And well, apart from that, there might be a little bit of commonality in terms of maintenance, but that wasn't much of a problem anyway. So really, there's not that much advantage in building the Groms as tribals, and one big disadvantage, which is that the Isle of Wight might get plastered a lot harder if Błyskawica is still in tribal configuration as opposed to her historic configuration. And finally, Mason asks, regarding the Revenge class, after the loss of Royal Oak, which were the most and least modernised ships of the class, and do you have a favourite amongst the 5 Rs? Well, in terms of a favourite, I have to name Royal Oak, because, well, as some of you long-term listeners might know, one of my great uncles went down with her in Scapa Flow. Unfortunately, he took the safe option. He decided to join the Navy and become a stoker. Well, can't really be a stoker on an oil-fired ship, but you get the idea. Join the engineering crew, officially named stoker. And thought, well, I'm behind over a foot of armour steel in the heart of a battleship. This is about the safest place that I can be, as opposed to my 2 crazy brothers who have decided to go into armoured cars in the desert and tail gunner in a bomber, respectively. But of course, he was the one to die and the other 2 made it through. And then, of course, my granddad, who was too young to join up, who decided that clearly the safest way of seeing out the war was to climb over crashed German bombers and steal all the machine gun ammo. But, yeah, that's my family for you. But in terms of the remaining ships, the most modernised appears to be something of a toss-up between Revenge and Royal Sovereign. All 4 of those ships, in fact all 5 ships, had refits in 1938-39, albeit obviously nowhere near as extensive as the Queen Elizabeth Valiant and Warspite. But tabulating the various changes in the late 1930s that were made during their refits, it would appear, as I say, that depending on exactly where you put the most weight, it's either Revenge or Royal Sovereign with the advantage. I suspect, given that they appear to have wanted to give the Russians the most capable of the Revenge class, it's probably just edging out Royal Sovereign, albeit that is after the war's pretty much over. And obviously they're having refits and accumulating damage, etc. during that period as well. In terms of least upgraded, that appears to be Ramillies. And then Resolution is kind of sitting in the middle between the first 2 and Ramillies in terms of, at least by the start of the war, what equipment she's received. And I think over time, during the war, with various impacts and everything, I think that kind of roughly stays about the same throughout the war. And that brings us to an end to this particular Drydock. Thank you very much for listening. There's no tremendous amount of channel admin to note this particular week. I'm really, really hoping that the new Omicron variant doesn't mess with international travel, because, of course, as you know, I've been preparing for my US trip. To be honest, I'd be prepared for it to mess with international travel for a month or 2, as long as everything is back up and running by April. So, let's hope we're not doing this particular song and dance again. But other than that, hopefully everything will go for the best, and we shall all hopefully see each other, well, those of you who are showing up to various places, in April, scheduled to be published later in more detail. And there are a few other places I do want to go next year, and obviously I will be letting people know about those. Again, travel restrictions depending, but if you happen to be in Denmark, Poland, possibly Greece, those are definitely up on my priority list. Plus there's a bunch of places in the UK that I will definitely be going. So with all that said and done, thank you very much for listening once again, and see you again in another video.